This is a very special occasion this evening. We don't often have two occasions built into one, but we certainly have that in spades tonight. We've been working with John Behan and showing his work for well over 40 years at this stage, and it's always been a pleasure, a joy to work with him, and certainly a joy to experience his work as well. He's an extraordinarily eminent artist, and I'm not going to go into all of that kind of detail, but it is no surprise to us that a major publication should come its way devoted to John and to honour John and his work. And it's a great pleasure to also have Adrian Frazier here this evening. I have to congratulate him on his work, on his production, and his publisher, who's just beside us there, trying to look, well, he always looks like this. And the other triple pleasure I have this evening is to introduce a very dear old friend who is going to introduce the exhibition and launch the book at the same time. So would you welcome, please, Gearóid Ó
Tuathaigh. Tom. There's a sense, I suppose, in the presence of the exhibition works here, that you feel really language is a bit excessive or is not required at all. That really what you should do is dress up, get a reasonably decent bell, and just go about the countryside doing hear ye, and that you'd have done a better service than trying to talk for a time. But the convention is to say a few words about the exhibition itself, and indeed, as Tom mentioned, by a happy coincidence, to welcome Adrian's work also. The first thing, and it's a great privilege and pleasure, would be to salute John on an outstanding and magnificent exhibition that we have all here. An exhibition which in its range, both thematic and formal, is quite staggering, really. The striking excellence of its execution in all of these media, its soaring imaginative originality and energy, its matchless craftsmanship, and its sheer artistry. It is really a privilege to be present and to be surrounded by work of this kind. This is overwhelmingly new work, largely the work of recent years, but new work in terms of first exhibition. I think it's important just to state that at the outset. We're seeing here the work of an artist at the height of his powers. This is not a retrospect. It's an artist at the height of his powers. And I think we would all hope that in the years ahead, John will continue to have the energy, the commitment, as it were, and the will, really, to go on producing work of this kind and of any new directions that he may take. As I said, it's not a retrospect, and therefore it doesn't call for, and indeed doesn't allow any presumptuous summary, as it were, of the life and work. I think that would be out of order. It would certainly be beyond my competence to do it. But I think it does permit, nonetheless, on an occasion like this, some observations on the sources of inspiration, the artistic promptings, and the techniques and development of John that are represented in the exhibition here, but which have marked his work now for decades. And as it happens, happily, as I say, such observations will be enormously enriched from now on by the appearance published by Lilliput Press of Adrian Frazier's new study, Life and Work of John. I had the pleasure of reading it in an earlier form. A study that is warmly sympathetic and insightful, that is sharply perceptive throughout, and that is utterly engrossing in every way. And I thank Adrian as well. I think it's a wonderful, happy coincidence to have the exhibition in all its glory, and, as I say, such an insightful and sharp study of John in the round, as it were, coming out at the same time. Given the little patch of the forest that I have been occupied with, I hope harmlessly, over many decades. I would hope that John and all of you would allow me, as it were, a very brief historical excursus, as it were, just to settle, if only for myself, the sense of John Behan's significance in the cultural life of Ireland, really, over 5 decades. It's part of the conventional wisdom, indeed it's almost an unshakable truth at this stage, that the years 1958 to 1963 represent the hinge of modern Ireland. That it is in these years that Ireland pivots, as it were, in the new direction. That effectively, the turning away from De Valera's Ireland, the turning away from the Ireland of conservatism, a degree of benign at times, protectionism, cultural no less than economic, the strong deference to tradition, to conservation, and to all of the institutions who presided over tradition and conservation. And that effectively we then look in new directions. In the economic sphere with Whitaker, the move to free trade, and the journey to Europe, as it were, in the common market. In intellectual life, opening out the shutters, as we are told, the coming of television, the late and the Irish discovery of sex. And generally speaking, the beginnings of a challenge to deference, not necessarily a uniform and an instant defiance, but a challenge to deference which over time brought about a different Ireland from the late 60s onwards. Now, I don't need to rehearse the details of this. I think we do need, however, to look very often at particular domains of Irish society, particular cohorts of Irish society at a given period that is judged to be so faithful, to look more closely, to calibrate more closely what they can tell us about this general story. And the artists in Ireland and the art life of Ireland in these years is one fascinating domain in which one can test this hypothesis of the hinge and the pivot, as it were, of the new Ireland. And it is difficult to think of another artist whose work and life as richly provides evidence and documents that, or permits an examination of that, than John Behan. That's not to say that John Behan, his emergence and his maturation and development as an artist, as it were, is in any way determined by social cultural forces. That kind of determinism would not survive very long at the encounter with the sheer, unfathomable spark of genius that marks the individual work that's around us here this evening. But nonetheless, I think it is worth at least remembering that John Behan was a crucial figure in a challenging cohort from late 50s through to the mid-60s of artists. Challenging, as I say, conservatism, challenging establishments of different kinds. The establishment in the art world, the, as it seemed at least, self-perpetuating gatekeepers of standards and opportunities and values. And the way in which the new artists had to make their way, as it were, and had to challenge that conservatism, not least in the Arts Council, but not only in the Arts Council either. And this is without reference at all to the merits or the talents of individual members, but the collectivity in its sense of duty and privilege and power was a formidable one. And it was one which, as I say, a challenging collectivity, a young cohort of artists from the late 1950s found themselves obliged and prepared to challenge. Now, it is, I think, just worth pondering that, because I do believe that it has marked both the life and the work of John Behan since, in ways that are still, as it were, that still animate some of the strongest creative energies that mark his work. There are perhaps 2 or 3 aspects of it that I just want very briefly to mention. One of them is that ultimately this challenge was about freedom. It was about the freedom of artists to express themselves, to innovate, to experiment. And that freedom to find their own voice, to develop, to find their own artistic signatures, as it were, without an imprimatur or without conformity. That was the first thing, and it was quite important. And it wasn't just an abstraction about freedom and the independence of the artist. It had a very pressing, urgent, practical programme, as was evident in all of the campaigns. The independent artists, the project centre, the demand for a foundry in Ireland, for example, the demands regarding exhibition space, the freedom to exhibit work that hadn't been sanctioned, or that didn't require the sanction and wasn't seeking the sanction of the gatekeepers, as I say, of values and standards, and more crucially, of cultural institutions at the time. That was a significant challenge to take on. The second thing about it, I suppose, was a deep, not always proclaimed in if you like, in proclamation terms or in sloganized terms, but a deep conviction, a credo, that art was for all. That essentially art and its social value, as Adrian has illustrated again and again in his fine study, that art essentially was for the elevation to a sense of beauty, in communal terms, rather than for privileged or mothballed, as it were, elites in key institutions. That access to art, the ability, the possibility of appreciation beauty in art, was something that was a communal entitlement, and that arrangements must be made to facilitate it in every way. Exhibition was one, the support of the state, the role of the Arts Council itself, the responsibility of the artist. A large and very, very pressing agenda. Now, there was no faddish bohemianism about this so far as John Behan was concerned. The hard work and grind of learning his trade and moving towards his own particular personal signature in art, in form and so on, and the heavy apprenticeship under Paddy McElroy, I think, would have allowed little room for faddish or for fashionable or modish bohemianism. But nonetheless, it was a hugely challenging project to embark upon. And the last part of it that I think has been absolutely crucial, and where we are hugely in his debt and the debt of others of that cohort, was in their determination that the artist could earn a living, and that good art could be produced in Ireland itself. That they did not have to seek cunning and exile or an opportunity elsewhere. That it was possible to stay in Ireland, to earn a living, and to do the very best art that they could do and that could be done in the media in which they were working. In short, their commitment to that, of the great choice that Hirschman had, they determined that their stand would be on voice rather than exit. And they did not exit. And we are hugely in their debt because of that, and the body of work they produced, and the service they rendered to Irish society as a whole. Now, this is not something I'm going to go any further on. As I said, I've indulged myself on the historical excursus probably long enough. But I think it is nonetheless this rebel credo, if I can put it that way, of a half century ago of the young Behan, has, I think, in its essential elements endured throughout a lifetime of quite extraordinary achievement. Thus, for example, the company he kept was a wide company of different artists working in different media. There were writers, painters, as well as sculptors. And that wide curiosity and alertness and openness to the artistic promptings of different kinds of artists with different kinds of artistic representation fructified his own work from a very early stage and continued to do so, as we can see in all of the different cultural references that mark the best of the work around here, that mark all of the work around here. For example, he's wide reading, he's a voracious reader, his alertness to the work of artists working in different media, as I say, his curiosity, the imaginative spark, and being able in a moment of observation or of reflection to see the possibility of an original and striking image. And his genius in realizing that possibility, the sheer range and virtuosity of his gifts in sketching, drafting, printing, and above all, of course, in sculpting, shaping the material into the perfect form for what he wishes to represent. This formidable repertoire of the creative resources of Behan's imagination, his eye, and his hand has produced a magnificent corpus of work, thematic and formal, over some 5 decades. It's an imagination that engages with a plenitude of cultural references, assuredly but unobtrusively always to hand. Themes in mythology, Irish and other, epic historical episodes, which are part of his public art, the famine, the flight of the Earls, and other, the public art of which we're all, if you like, very familiar, so iconic has it become. His bulls, birds, fish, insects, and other creatures of nature. Human figures with, where appropriate, just the right amount, the right references to culture and context. And the utter appropriateness, really, of scale, form, and texture to the subject in hand is quite remarkable. The new work here this evening is a magnificent exhibition in Kenny's this evening that demonstrates triumphantly, as it were, this range of themes, the mastery of technique in various materials and forms, especially in bronze. And it really just celebrates the sheer imaginative brio and craftsmanship of an artist at the height of his powers. Each of these media, if one looks around, whether it is the prints, the mixed media, or indeed the bronze work par excellence, would produce a formidable exhibition in its own right. When one sees all of them together from the one hand, it is an extraordinary experience. And even within each media, the sheer diversity of texture and form that he achieves, which sharper eyes than mine would be able to offer more subtle commentary on. But it is striking, if I could take the most obvious one of all, the way in which the different patina on the bronze utterly fits the form and the theme and the mood that he's trying to create. If one looks, for example, at the spectral haunting patina on the famine ship, the Cork famine ship, or the others, and see how it works, and then contrast it, for example, with the kind of the lustrous ribbing of the shields in the Ferdia and Chuchanan, you can see just the sheer range and virtuosity working within the same medium and with the exact same material. And I don't want to talk about individual items, and this is an exhibition for everybody to enjoy and to respond to on their own terms. But I can't help but remark on a number of them, and I just made notes of them when I came out to see the exhibition before it went on formal show this evening. And this is merely a selection. It is not by any means an exhaustive, if you like, a forced night march around the walls, as it were, or anything of that kind. The bulls, the range and variety of them. Behan's bulls are generally referred to, or more commonly referred to, for the sheer kind of awesome muscularity that marks them. And certainly the Sheriff Street bull and some of the bulls here are characterised by that classic muscularity. But there's a great variety in those bulls. The London bull, for example, is an utterly different characterisation. An utterly different characterisation and suggestive of mobility and of function that is different and different in execution as well. Indeed, there are differences between all of them. The green bull, the canal bull, the white bull, and indeed I was, with some anxiety, made my way to the Mayo bull. And I'm satisfied on inspection that it is what it says, and that it has no troubling metaphorical references to our neighbours. It is simply the Mayo bull, formidable in all its glory. A thing occurred to me was the meaning of the word táin in Irish is something that struck me, because we generally see, because of táin bóchúilne, we see a táin as the cattle raid, a raid of cattle, as it were, a booty. But of course, táin has a more ample meaning, which is to say the treasure, the wealth itself, is far an tláinte and an táinte. So that essentially, the bulls themselves as a collectivity are John's táin. They are his wealth, as it were, as a collectivity, and it chimes nicely with his returning to the Ulster cycle and to the táin particularly. The birds, the owls themselves, material again utterly apt to fit the different characterizations of the owls that are here, and of course the crow series, with its assured cross-references to Ted Hughes and to Hughes's crow series. Unobtrusive, unfussy, unmannered, yet utterly fit, utterly right, as it were, the manner in which the arrangement is done. And there are others that I don't want to look at. The mythological saga repertoire, both Irish and indeed other. As I mentioned, the revisiting of the Ulster cycle with the magnificent Cuchulainn and Ferdio. And also in the different media, these wonderful new mixed media with the Maeve's warriors and the tribes that have a striking effect, a three-dimensional effect when you see them hanging on the wall. The Icarus theme, the big ones, and again, talking about cross-references and the easy cross-references to literary works, the man with the oar, and its acknowledgement of Moya Cannon's working of the Greek legend of the man with the oar, and the ease with which a piece of art that is itself freestanding still manages to resonate and to refer culturally, utterly assuredly, to the literary work as well. Ships, both Irish and Mediterranean in their provenance and in what they carry. The ghost ships and boats, the archaeological promptings here, both Irish and Mediterranean. And a feature, the elongated oars, the way in which the elongated oars function as a kind of monumental scaffolding in order to elevate the vessel itself and to draw attention to what the narrative is. And there is more intimate versions of that. For example, the Corna boat building is an intimate and local but delightfully realised version of that also. And the curved oar boats on stilts also. There are ships and boats, of course, with particular and specific historical references. And indeed, the historical references, I won't labour the point because it was pointed up at earlier exhibitions. John's commitment, essentially, to looking to the visual gap, as it were, between medieval Ireland and the 20th century representations of the Irish historical experience in visual art form, and the way in which the key episodes are marked by such huge contributions from himself, Flight of the Earls, famine, and so on. Here, the famine theme, which is one of the themes that he has been most profoundly concerned with and engaged with in many exhibitions, the famine theme comes in new material. The Famine Family series, for example, is there. And I was struck by survivors. Now, the survivors down here on the right, it is certainly survivors in the specific Irish context of the famine. It meets that. But it has a more universal statement about survivors as well. Particularly the haunting and hollowed out skull. The Irish word is better on this, the blesk. And you could see this as universal, the two figures with the hollowed out. Kind of blesk an ufash, or blesk mishkile. That kind of universal terror of a survivor of a calamity. And it captures it so well and so economically and so hauntingly that one is struck by it. As I say, the Cork famine ship itself, with the elongated emaciation, not just of the corpses, but in the very rigging of the ship, that it is the carrier of emaciation, so to speak, the vessel itself. Now, I don't want to go on too long. I probably have overstayed my welcome already, Tom. But I think there is also a case for mentioning the gallery of individual characterizations and portraits that are in bronze here. The man with scrolls and Moses are two. Now, Adrian resolves this better than I could, and I still can't resolve it. The carrying of the scrolls and the Moses figure as lawgiver, or in the case of the scrolls, as the figure who is the repository of learning and tradition and wisdom. One would have thought I can't fathom the particular acknowledgement that John is making in these scroll figures. I am unwilling to concede that it is an acknowledgement and a deference to lawmakers or lawgivers by character and instinct. Is it the other? Is it an acknowledgement of the ancient repositories of wisdom, of Guish, as it were, the wisdom of the ages? Whatever it is, they are striking, and they keep on prompting you to ask the question, what is going on? The Innisseer pint drinker over there. Well, in this instance, I think he is unlikely to be mistaken for a lawgiver. That much I can resolve very easily. But having said that, it is a very striking, and there's a wonderful sense as he sits with the pipe, the unmovable, if you like, satisfaction. The Irish phrase, such soch, absolutely right and filled up. Such soch, sitting there and essentially letting the world go by. The Cladder fisherwoman, again, prompted by what? By a photograph? By an earlier image? Prompted, yes, but realised independently in its own right. Now, I'm a bit embarrassed to mention the next one, which is Sean O'Brien, the back row forward of the Irish rugby team, who is there as the Tullow tank. After the events of the recent days, it probably would be better to pass over this discreetly. And certainly I have no intention of resorting to such a lazy pun as saying that it too packs a punch. I will not do anything of that kind, but nonetheless, it is a very finely realised figure now. Lastly, and very briefly, there are miscellaneous, as I said, there are fish and insects, formidably solid, the fish just behind us here. And as for the insect, there is the spider, the wonderful spider here, which is, as I say, fit for purpose, and which will be going back on this plinth in a moment. The Tree of Life, and there are more abstract Picasso's Kitchen and some other works that are, and a slightly more perplexing early work of Iron Venus, perplexing to me certainly, but there's such an array. And I suppose, the other mixed media ones that are, again, that would certainly repay close inspection of the materials that went into them. The Secret Life of Toby Diskin, with Welded Steel and Mixed Media, and the Mr. Pussy. There are mixed media where you need to look closely just to see the miracle of creative work when you see the innards and the materials out of which these were put together. Now, as I say, it's not something that one should go on for too long about, except that one would love to. There is such, you just love simply to talk and ruminate and just simply marinate in the wonderful array of skill and beauty that has been presented and that is around us here. The constant inspiration for John's work of recent years, inhibited here and for many years, was of course Emer. And theirs a companionship of love and shared discovery and wonder for a quarter of a century, until she left us too early in the Christmas Vigil days of 2012. There is a sense, I'm sure, I certainly feel it, that at some deep level of inspiration, the work here is part of a continuing conversation, a continuing affirmation or communion of love and companionship, and a celebration of life and living between Emer and John. One senses that in much of the recent work. Finally, I suppose, Adrian Frazier very properly reminds us in one of his many sharp insights that are studied throughout this wonderful volume that has just been published. Adrian Frazier reminds us of the sheer physicality of the work of a blacksmith artist as compared to other artists working in different media, and of the demands, the physical demands that it makes. I'm sure I frequently hear, and I'm damn certain that some of the others of you looking at the grey heads around here also hear with a degree of puzzlement, some of the younger generation invoking what they describe as the rather cheesy benediction of more recent icon from Star Wars, saying that the force be with you, as it were. Well, the old Irish version of that was more concise and more forceful. It was Tresha Leat. Tresha Leat translated into colloquial English as more power to you. And I think looking around here this evening, one would say to John Behan, with our profound gratitude, Tresha Leat, John Behan, ad multos annos. And in the meantime, let us simply salute and rejoice in the latest bounty from this major artist. Gaudiamus.